This is the first time this material has been shown in more than 25 years.
It's been very well received. It's stimulated scholarly conversations here at the university, and the crowds just keep coming.
This story, both as a novel and as a film, seems to have captured, if not the zeitgeist, something extraordinary in its moment.
The issues still resonate. Dealing with the Deep South, dealing with race, and dealing with, just the Civil War era in a fairly straightforward way.
Gone with the Wind really spoke to people in such a strong way, and you'll see this in the exhibit, that it's still reverberating today.
"75 years after its spectacular premiere, Gone with the Wind remains one of the most celebrated and controversial films of Hollywood's golden age by scholars, critics, and devoted fans. Gathered from the collection of David O. Selznick, the Making of Gone with the Wind exhibition at the Ransom Center tells the story behind the iconic film, which, adjusted for inflation, is the highest-grossing film of all time.
The exhibition, The Making of Gone with the Wind, is drawn completely from the Ransom Center's archives. We've spent the last 3 years going through this material. We've read through some 40,000 pages of documents and put it all together to tell this incredible story. There are more than 400 items in the exhibition, including David O. Selznick's famous memos, hundreds of behind-the-scenes photographs in the making of the film, and 3 original dresses worn by Vivien Leigh, including the famous curtain dress.
I think especially what the exhibition does so beautifully is to offer that moment, those 3 years between 1936 and 1939, as a real flashpoint for American cultures, thinking about things like slavery, Reconstruction, certainly the Civil War itself, but more broadly, what to do with the U.S. South in the 1930s and beyond.
The exhibition tells the story of the making of Gone with the Wind from the very first teletype that Selznick received from his story editor, Kay Brown, saying that I've just discovered this novel, we've got to get the rights to it, through the 3-day extravaganza of the film in Atlanta for the premiere, just in time for the Academy Awards.
One of many things the Ransom Center did that was so smart was to draw together a really wide coalition of folks who have taught, read, written about the film, and put it into a context so that exhibit goers could really have a sense of the fights, the debates, the sort of deep-seated controversies around the movement from the book to the film.
The Ransom Center is the one place in the world they could really put on this exhibition. Is something that really impresses the students and makes them really proud of the University of Texas for having the foresight to collect such things.
Without Selznick's detailed collection at UT, the history behind the classic film would not exist. The university acquired Selznick's collection in 1980, and while it covers his entire life and legacy, it focuses on the peak of his career that lasted 2 decades. When he set out to make Gone with the Wind in 1936, Selznick was already considered one of the smartest and most talented producers in Hollywood.
David Selznick was one of the many so-called boy wonders of the early Hollywood era, the studio era. He started as a studio guy, ran Paramount, had his own production unit at MGM, and then went independent to make Gone with the Wind.
Selznick brought Alfred Hitchcock to the United States. He brought Ingrid Bergman to the United States. He discovered people like Gene Kelly and Gregory Peck, and so the beginnings of so many important actors and directors and writers are represented here.
Selznick is one of the rare instances of a producer as auteur. He was one of the first guys that understood, and this movie is a great example, the value of making one big movie as opposed to lots of medium-sized or littler movies.
Before the world ever saw Selznick's film, the novel Gone with the Wind had already made a huge impression on the public. Author Margaret Mitchell captured the feeling of America at the time and would win the Pulitzer Prize in 1937.
One thing that people often miss is that the book's release in 1936 comes right at the end of the Great Depression. And as a result, it's into that context that I think we need to understand the book's just really rapturous reception.
I think that Gone with the Wind is really the story of the Great Depression more than it is a story of the Civil War. The things that were of great concern to the American audience at that time are reflected in this story. Things like hunger, food insecurity, we would call it today, was a big problem. There were a lot of people hungry during the Great Depression. So when Scarlett says, you know, I'll never go hungry again, that really resonated with people.
You know, Gone with the Wind is a book that really does try to come to terms with issues of, you know, of race, of class, of gender, and it really does all of those things pretty aggressively. These are not curiosities. I mean, these are phenomena that are worth looking at in and of themselves, but still resonate, that still are important to the people that watch and read them.
It became obvious that everybody in the country understood that this was going to be a powerful motion picture, that it was going to influence people, influence how they view history, how they view their own country, and how they view other people.
The Making of Gone with the Wind, the exhibition at the Harry Ransom Center at the University of Texas, offers a close-up look into how producer David Selznick oversaw and struggled with the demands of making his masterpiece. Selznick, on the set, was a perfectionist, working at a manic pace, fueled by amphetamines. He brought in 14 screenwriters, including F. Scott Fitzgerald, to get the script exactly how he wanted it.
You know, Selznick was obsessive at this point in his career in terms of the scope of the production. Multiple units shooting at once, the directors that came and went on this movie.
2 weeks into the filming, Selznick decides that the work that George Cukor, the director, is delivering is not right for the film, and so they part ways, and they bring in Victor Fleming from Wizard of Oz to try to corral this massive story and these hundreds of actors into making this one story. This obsession with Gone with the Wind, I don't think gave him a feeling that he could do anything he wanted. I think just the opposite. I think it gave him a big sense of responsibility to get it right in a lot of different ways. First of all, he wanted to be faithful to the novel. Also, he had lots of these fan letters that came in urging Selznick to be careful with accents and be careful with architecture and be careful with the Southern culture, and that he needed to get that right. And that was something that he had to wrestle with.
You have groups as diverse as the Ku Klux Klan, the United Daughters of the Confederacy, and the NAACP, all trying to influence Selznick's decisions as an artist, all trying to influence how the film would look.
There was major outfits that were opposed to the making of this film or the depiction, certain types of depiction in this film. I think he very keenly appreciated the importance of not getting people too upset in all directions. And somehow, with all those directors and all those writers and all those casting issues, he makes a film that completely works.
Adding to the stress of making the film was the epic scale of many of the scenes. Selznick utilized the latest innovations in film to capture the grand scale of his vision. Some of his own ideas would be replicated for decades by Hollywood directors.
It would be difficult to identify pieces of this film that weren't pretty exceptional in terms of the scale of the production design. This took the whole idea of designing a movie to another level.
Some of the crane shots and tracking shots, burning of Atlanta, the Civil War casualties laying in Atlanta, the scale of the production, it's truly amazing.
Technicolor was a new thing at that time, and they weren't at all sure that they should shoot it in color. They thought they should shoot it in black and white for a long time. They thought they should shoot it as, release it as two separate films for a while because it was such a huge story, they couldn't fit it into a small enough package.
A lot of people consider 1939 the greatest year in the history of the movie industry, the movie business, the art of cinema. And to have made a film like Gone with the Wind that really stands out among all of those great movies was an accomplishment.
The technology during production would help cement the film's place in history. But before cameras started rolling, the world was already eagerly awaiting news on who would play Scarlett O'Hara and Rhett Butler. An entire section of the exhibit is dedicated to the search for the leading lady.
There came to be what the people in Hollywood called a parlor game across America of guessing who's going to play Scarlett O'Hara. That became a national obsession very quickly.
The casting of Clark Gable was a big deal. Margaret Mitchell was pretty out front about writing Rhett Butler with Clark Gable in mind. The search for Scarlett was a publicity stunt on the one hand, and on the other hand, it was very real. I mean, it was this was one of the most important casting decisions in the history of the business. This is when Howard Hughes and Katharine Hepburn were a very serious item, and Howard Hughes was trying to convince Selznick to cast Katharine Hepburn as Scarlett.
Selznick had put out the word that he wanted a new personality to play Scarlett O'Hara and invited ordinary people to submit their photos and write in to ask for this. And we know that there were hundreds of thousands of letters written. Selznick kept about 6,000 of those.
So many Americans in 1930s era America identified with that role because of the pending war that was coming, because of the Depression.
There were protests, there were letter writing campaigns, there were people offering themselves up as Scarlett, saying, no, 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 I'm your Scarlett. Really, I'm the one you've been looking for. My mother, who grew up in the South, tells lots of stories about every beauty queen in Mississippi sort of feeling it was her duty to write with a photograph to the production team and say, no, no, really, you should consider me.
Vivian Leigh, who gets the part, it was a last minute, and very much a last minute contender. And there are famous pictures of Selznick watching the burning of Atlanta that was staged on the RKO lot, and while his brother, who's a top agent, Myron Selznick, is walking up behind him with Vivian Leigh on his arm. And he says, I want to introduce you to your Scarlett.
3 years after work began on the film, Gone with the Wind premiered to massive crowds in Atlanta. 30,000 people lined the streets to catch a glimpse of stars Clark Gable and Vivian Leigh.
Gone with the Wind writes history, a new chapter in film triumphs.
And this was the biggest movie ever made. It was going to be the biggest hit ever, and it was. And it was going to have the biggest debut. It was a huge success.
When Gone with the Wind was released in 1939, there was mobs of people going to see the film. There was a curiosity about the images of the South, specifically slavery.
The fact that the film comes out at a premiere that is segregated, and Hattie McDaniel, who plays the Mammy character, is not allowed to be there is striking and tells you a lot about America in 1939.
The Academy of Motion Pictures celebrated Gone with the Wind with 10 Oscars. Hattie McDaniel, who won for Best Supporting Actress, was the first African American to win the award. Despite the film's praise, there were deep-rooted concerns about the portrayal of African Americans in the film. Selznick wrestled with these racial issues throughout the film's production and release.
The black press was very upset about the film from the beginning. When it was announced that the rights were purchased by Selznick, they started a campaign of trying to not let the film actually be released.
African-American newspapers like the Pittsburgh Courier and African-American activist groups like the NAACP were deeply worried what this would mean for Black America, that this film was going to be made in such a big way by David O. Selznick in his studio.
But at the same time, black actors in Hollywood were actively trying out for the parts that were available. So there was a strange tension within the community because other actors felt that they could tell a different story. The black press was concerned about the history of the Civil War and the images of slavery.
Selznick decided he would be able to really walk a fine line in trying to make all the stakeholders, all the fans and foes of the book as happy as they could. Some of those, for instance, changing how the scene in the shanty town works, changing what race the person that assaults Scarlett is, hiding the sort of identity of the Ku Klux Klan in the film, calling it a political meeting, famously. That did seem to tamp down some of the concern. Removing particularly problematic hate speech was another decision that I think helped to buffer some of the critiques that would come.
He wanted to use terms like darky and images like the N-word that was, that's really a difficult word even today to use and to hear. And he was cautioned by the NAACP that that word should not be in the script, even though it was in the book.
There's definitely a pushback that people now maybe don't realize what's going on at the time of the production of the film and when it comes out, some of which was successful in finally getting to Selznick and making him realize that you couldn't rightfully use the N-word in the film the way he thought he could use it.
When Gone with the Wind was released in 1939, there was mobs of people going to see the film. Within the African-American community, there was a number of protests. They had the same lines, but picket lines, because they were concerned about the images that were presented that demean black people. They were concerned about the language of the film. They were concerned about how images were presented about black women and black people specifically. So there were dual audiences, even though there were images that represented both kind of communities in different ways.
For an African-American woman to win an Oscar in 1939 was unheard of, and sufficiently unheard of that she couldn't even attend the Oscar ceremony. The nation, let alone the industry, had yet to really come to terms at all with issues of race at this point.
Because film is such a collaborative medium, it means that especially actors, for instance, Hattie McDaniel, is making decisions on how she's going to present Mammy as a figure.
She understood the importance of that role, and she said that she thought that as any other actor would apply for it, that she could do justice to the role. She created morality for Scarlett. She was really the one who would correct Scarlett on how to perform and act in public, but also protect her in a motherly way.
You can see in this exhibition, people are flocking to see this because they're still fascinated by it. I think it has something to do with the complexity of the film. And I suspect 75 years from now, they're going to have, historians will develop even further insights about the making of the film, the world of the film, the film depicts in terms of Reconstruction and the Civil War.
75 years after Gone with the Wind's release, a new generation of fans are getting exposed to the film for the first time. Many are drawn to it by the dazzling costumes. 5 of Scarlett O'Hara's dresses are on display at the University of Texas. Jill Morena is the curator in charge of preserving these costumes.
It's very rewarding to see people come in and get so excited to see a costume that they've never seen before in person. Some of the costumes on display haven't been seen in over 30 years, and many people have only experienced the costume through the film. I think these dresses are so iconic in large part due to Vivien Leigh. She turns in such a terrific performance as Scarlett O'Hara, and really her performance and her embodiment of that character is really inseparable from these costumes. And Selznick was very aware of his female audience and women as moviegoers, and the costumes were considered a big draw for a female audience. It is really our charge to preserve these costumes so that they can survive well into the future, but also make them accessible to the public so that they can enjoy them.
The Harry Ransom Center has had a tremendous response to the dresses that highlight the exhibition. Fans, young and old, come from all over to see the collection on display.
We're hearing a lot of stories about people traveling from out of state and even out of the country. I got an email today from someone I know is coming here from England specifically to see this exhibition.
To see the exhibition draw such enthusiastic audiences, and also to be able to put that familiar history in a new scholarly context based on the archive itself is very, very gratifying.
I think the film has generally been something that is kind of passed on from generation to generation.
The next generation are current students at the University of Texas, and UT professors are using the exhibition at the Harry Ransom Center as a classroom and taking the opportunity to teach Gone with the Wind to their students. Dr. Randolph Lewis teaches in the American History Department.
I'm requiring all of my students to come for my classes to see the exhibition and have these tours. And I think they're really fascinated by the depth of the material that's on display that the Ransom Center has.
Interestingly, before Clark Gable, our Rhett Butler was available, and before Vivien Leigh, Scarlett had even been cast. They filmed The Burning of Atlanta.
It's a true American icon in ways that are kind of puzzling and wonderful and fascinating to tease out. There's a lot about the film that is powerful and striking and compelling, and there's a lot about the film that's problematic and quite disturbing.
I think it's very interesting to see the dynamics of the film, the creation of it, and the premiere, where the black characters were not allowed to be at the premiere.
It really kind of let myself immerse into the production of Gone with the Wind, and really just kind of see the controversies and all of the work that was put into making this film.
It's a great pleasure to be able to introduce students to these collections, because one knows that it can have an impact far beyond the semester.
One of the things that I want them to really come away from this with is the power of myth in American society to shape our assumptions and expectations about the way the world is in this country and the way it has been, maybe the way it could be.
The Ransom Center exhibition highlights the enduring legacy that Gone with the Wind will continue to have on literature, film, and history well into the future.
I love thinking about what a film like this or any other American icon will be, how it will be perceived in the future, decades from now.
It's constantly moving across all these different orders of time and offering audiences, each successive generation of audiences, different points of entry, different ways of engaging.
And I think that the issues still resonate. It's a movie about an aggressive female who, takes life by the horns, deals with huge obstacles, and it's in a historically significant moment that we still are interested in, and that we still, so many issues this film deals with, still haven't been resolved.
Gone with the Wind has shown us that there's a hunger for these kinds of stories, that there's a craving for the artifacts themselves, that history is real. And if we can continue to tell compelling stories in future exhibitions based on the success here we've had with Gone with the Wind, that'll be a wonderful outcome.